C.M.Russell Museum Complex is an art museum located in the city of Great Falls, Montana, in the United States. The museum's primary function is to display the artwork of Great Falls cowboy artist Charles Marion Russell, for whom the museum is named. The museum also displays illustrated letters by Russell, work materials used by him, and other items which help visitors understand the life and working habits of Russell. In addition, the museum displays original 19th, 20th, and 21st century art depicting the American Old West and the flora, fauna, and landscapes of the American West. In 2009, the Wall Street Journal called the institution one of America's premier Western art museums. Located on the museum property is Russell's log cabin studio, as well as his two-story wood-frame home. The house and log cabin studio were designated a National Historic Landmark in 1965, and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1976. Beginning in 1969, the museum co-hosted the C.M. Russell Auction of Original Western Art, an auction of 19th, 20th, and 21st century art of the American West whose proceeds benefit the museum. The auction has received media attention in Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In 2010, the two co-hosts parted ways, and the C.M. Russell Museum inaugurated a new auction, the Russell History of the Museum. Founding of the museum, Emma Josephine Trigg was the daughter of Albert Trigg, owner of the Brunswick Saloon in Great Falls. She became an art teacher in the Great Falls public schools, and in 1911 became the children's librarian at the Great Falls Public Library. Trigg later was briefly married to W.T. Ridgely, a local printer who published books of Russell's works as well as an autobiography of a local civic leader which Russell illustrated. The Brunswick Saloon was one of Russell's favorite bars, and Albert Trigg allowed Russell to use one of his back rooms as an art studio. In 1900, Russell built a two-story clapboard house near the Trigg home, and in 1903 built a log cabin studio on an empty lot between the two houses. Russell became acquainted with Miss Josephine when Trigg was a teenager, and they remained friends for the rest of Russell's life. Trigg often accompanied Russell and his wife on vacations, and she provided calligraphy for many of his letters, postcards, and illustrated items. Charles M. Russell was a professional artist for the last 30 years of his life. He created an estimated 4,000 to 4,500 works of art. His wife, Nancy Russell, retained some works, including a large number of models and molds from which bronze sculptures had been cast, as well as nearly all of Charlie Russell's papers. When she died in 1940, the papers were given to her adopted son, Jack, but most of Russell's artwork had been sold during his lifetime. Sid Willis, proprietor of the Mint Saloon in Great Falls, allowed Russell to drink there in exchange for paintings, and by the time of Russell's death had amassed a collection of 90 oil paintings, watercolors, drawings, models, wax sculptures, and ephemera. In 1948, Willis put his collection up for sale. A Charles Russell Memorial Committee unsuccessfully attempted to raise the purchase price to keep the Mint collection in Montana. Texas newspaper publisher Amon G. Carter purchased the collection for $200,000 in 1952 and established the Amon Carter Museum to house it. C.R. Smith, chief executive officer of American Airlines, purchased 46 bronzes in 1940, while oil company executive Charles S. Jones purchased the remainder. The Amon Carter Museum eventually purchased the Smith bronzes as well, and as of 2000 owned about 60 Russell bronzes. Dr. Philip G. Cole, a New York City tire company executive, had collected 46 Russell paintings and 27 bronzes, and these passed into the collection of oilman Thomas Gilcrease in 1944. Wall Street financier Malcolm S. Mackay collected another 60 paintings, watercolors, ink drawings, bronzes, letters, Christmas cards, and photographs. These were loaned to the Northern Hotel in Billings in 1942, and in 1952 were purchased by the Montana Historical Society Museum for $59,000. A collection of 16 works, held by the family of Cleveland, Ohio, banker and philanthropist George Gunn, was permanently loaned to the Untitled Museum of American Indians and Western Art. Josephine Trigg, however, had a collection of 153 oil paintings, watercolors, illustrated letters, bookmarks, models, and postcards, many of which did not depict Old West images. Triggs will established a Trigg C.M. Russell Foundation and donated these items to the city, provided that the city built a museum to house the collection within 2 years. Leonard Reagan, an executive with the Montana Power Company, led a fundraising drive which netted $75,000, and in 1953 the Trigg Russell Memorial Gallery opened on September 26, 1953. The building cost $58,175 to construct. Museum history. In its first 2 years, the museum had 38,000 visitors. In 1957, its first major non-Russell show, an exhibit of Norman Rockwell original paintings, opened. From 1955 to 1958, the museums saw visitorship of roughly 10,500 a year. The average yearly drop-off of more than a third led the museum to broaden its scope. In 1960, the museum's board of directors agreed to expand the collection to include contemporary artists depicting the Old West. Also in 1960, the Great Falls chapter of the Junior League paid for a study which analyzed expanding the museum. In 1962, the Amon Carter Museum's Mint collection was exhibited at the museum. Promotion of the museum, its expanding collection, and the Mint collection exhibit dramatically raised visitorship to more than 23,000 people in 1963. With visitorship rising, local construction company owner and philanthropist John L. McLaughlin agreed to give the museum $100,000 to build an expansion if, in turn, the museum raised $350,000 in matching funds. With the fundraising campaign moving ahead swiftly, the local firm of Page Werner Architects was retained to design the addition. To boost the campaign, the Montana Stock Growers Association, owner of Russell's famous 1887 watercolor Waiting for a Chinook, agreed to let the museum exhibit the artwork which had made Russell a national name. Construction on the $307,000 addition began in 1968, and the new galleries opened in 1969. The fundraising campaign highlighted the need to diversify the Trigg Russell Memorial Gallery's sources of income. In 1968, local television personality and civic booster Norma Ashby proposed hosting a worldwide auction of Old West art, to be named the C.M. Russell Art Auction, to benefit the gallery. The auction would be held the same week as Russell's March 19th birthday. The Great Falls Ad Club, a non-profit organization of local business owners dedicated to promoting the local economy, agreed to co-host the auction with the gallery. The first auction was held in March 1969 at the Rainbow Hotel in Great Falls. In 1970, another new gallery space at the Trigg Russell opened. Charles A. Bovey, a wealthy Great Falls area rancher, had long been interested in the state's history. Bovey had collected numerous historic artifacts, preserved large numbers of historic state records, and even purchased and preserved historic buildings across the state. He also purchased and restored most of Virginia City, Montana, the former territorial capital which had become a ghost town. In 1969, Bovey and his wife financed the construction of a new gallery beneath the existing museum. The new lower gallery opened in 1970. In 1972, the Treg Russell Gallery was officially renamed the C.M. Russell Museum. Expansion of the collection followed. The museum was first accredited by the American Alliance of Museums in 1974. In 1975, Richard J. Flood donated a collection of more than 1,000 Russell letters, writings, postcards, and other memorabilia worth $600,000 to the museum. In 1979, Montana sculptor Robert Scriver's life-size bronze statue of Russell was donated to the museum and placed in front of the South Main entrance. By 1980, the museum had purchased several empty plots of land next to the museum. In 1982, with the collection still expanding, the C.M. Russell Museum undertook a $3 million capital fundraising campaign to double the size of the facility from 23,000 square feet to 46,000 square feet. The same year, the city of Great Falls, which owned the Russell Home and Log Cabin Studio, turned over management of both structures to the museum. In 1982, Bob Scriver's 53-piece sculptural history of the Piegan Blackfeet received its premiere at the museum. In 1985, with the fundraising campaign a success, the C.M. Russell Museum's new addition opened. By 1989, the museum had 7 galleries displaying 7,500 pieces, including artwork, memorabilia, firearms, and photographs. The collection included 80 Russell paintings, 120 Russell sculptures, 50 Russell drawings, and 27 illustrated Russell letters. The museum took formal ownership of the Russell Home and Studio in 1991, and in 1994 undertook a $250,000 renovation and preservation of the log cabin structure. The same year, the museum, which had 23 permanent and temporary staff, was re-accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. It was one of 5 museums out of the state's 68 that were accredited. The following year, the museum raised $1.1 million from a local residents to purchase Russell's large oil painting of a bull elk, the exalted ruler, for the local Elks Lodge No. 214. In 1968, the museum began managing another museum, the Bear Family Museum in Martinsdale, Montana. The museum began a second, 3-year, $5 million capital campaign in 1997, which was intended to fund construction of yet another expansion. The museum completed a $76,600 restoration of the exterior of the Russell Home the same year. The 1999, the museum had 46 permanent and temporary staff. The museum constructed a new parking lot on the north side of the museum that same year. The museum also sold the historic 3-story brick strain home at 825 4th Avenue North to local attorney Channing Hart Elias for about $295,000. The Trails to the Future capital campaign closed in 2000 with a total of $6.5 million raised. The planned expansion expansion added 30,000 square feet to the museum's total interior space, and with other renovations increased the gallery space by 33,000 square feet. The building itself cost $5 million, with the rest going for other purposes. The new gallery space was used to house more Russell artworks, as well as the horse-drawn hearse used during Russell's 1926 funeral. It also included a new exhibition space, the New West Gallery, intended to feature contemporary artists. Other new galleries included a children's space, a photography gallery, and the Good Medicine Gallery dedicated to depictions of Native Americans and the culture. The museum also opened a new gallery dedicated to the work of Russell contemporary O.C. Seltzer, a sculpture garden featuring 20 works by sculptor Bob Scriver, and a new Frederick G. Renner library and research center to house the museum's reference and archival materials. The new expansion opened in 2001. According to the Great Falls Tribune, a local newspaper, with the expansion, the museum reached a sort of critical mass that tipped it into the ranks of the world's major Western art museums. One of the biggest logistical changes the expansion made was moving the main entrance of the museum from the south to the north side. The new galleries featured walls in warm earth tones. Hundreds of artworks in storage were put on display. The expansion also allowed the museum to display the Mint Saloon's original safe. T.D. Kelsey's bronze sculpture of two bison, Change of Seasons, was placed near the east entrance. The next year, the Allen Foundation for the Arts gave the museum a $10,000 grant to help it build visitorship. Also in 2002, an anonymous bidder purchased the Russell watercolor, waiting for $240,000, and then donated it to the museum. In 2003, facing high costs to keep the museum open, the C.M. Russell Museum closed the Bear Family Museum. In March 2003, the museum purchased Russell's oil painting Four Generations. The work had been owned by the local salvage firm Carl Weissman and Amp Sons, Inc., but in 1962 the company gave the museum a one-third interest in it. The firm went bankrupt in 2002 and was ordered to sell its remaining interest in the painting. The purchase price for the $260,000 work was $173,342. Later that year, clay sculptures depicting the museum through the years were installed in the sculpture garden. In 2004, the museum changed the way it displayed its Russell works. Previously, the museum had displayed the best-known and biggest pieces more prominently, with smaller pieces surrounding them to enhance their appearance. The museum now began displaying pieces chronologically to show how Russell developed as an artist. Among the early works were two small oil paintings Russell did at the age of 13 and another painted when he was 14. The same year, the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences gave the museum $150,000 to enhance its curatorial capacity. The museum raised another $305,000 to match the grant. A month later, the Dufresne Foundation gave the museum $100,000. Restructuring of the galleries continued in 2005. The museum moved the 200-piece Browning firearms collection to the front of the museum and installed the original back bar of the Mint Saloon in one of the galleries. The museum also opened a cafe in the museum, which proved to be highly popular. Two steel sculptures by Billings artist Lyndon Pomeroy, Cow in the Mountains, and Wheat, were installed on the boulevard on the far side of the north parking lot. In 2007, the Mitch family donated more than 50 Scriver bronzes to museum. The Mitches owned the foundry where Scriver had his works cast, and bartered the services to him for artwork. The following year, the museum received a $375,000 grant from the National Endowment for the Arts in support of its new exhibition, The Bison, American Icon, Hat of Plains Indian Culture. The total cost of the exhibit was $1.5 million. NAIA's Tom Phelps called the show a nationally significant exhibition. The following year, the NE gave the museum another $50,000 stimulus funds to cover a severe shortfall in visitorship. In March 2011, the John Jack McDowell Hoover donated 3 works by Russell and 1 by Seltzer to the museum. The 3 Russell works were The Lone Wolf, a large oil painting depicting solitary wolf on the plains, The Last Laugh, a bronze of a wolf standing on a human skull, and When the Longest Blade Was Right, a watercolor of Knight on horseback threatening a court jester with a sword. The C.M. Russell Museum was re-accredited in 2011 by the American Alliance of Museums for another 10 years. As of 2011, the museum consisted of 76,000 square feet of gallery and other space, and owned about 2,000 pieces of art, personal items, and artifacts associated with Russell. Attendance and revenues. The museum had approximately 19,000 visitors a year in 1953 and 1954. From 1955 to 1958, the museum saw visitorship of roughly 10,500 a year. Visitorship rose to more than 23,000 people a year in 1963. By 2003, the museum said that 76% of its visitors were non-Montanans. In 2006, the museum's executive director said that the organization's revenues are generated, in roughly equal parts, by the annual auction event, membership payments and donations, museum admissions, museum shop and art sales. The Russell auction had sales of $1.35 million in 2011. The Russell, the sale to benefit the C.M. Russell Museum. In 1969, the Great Falls Ad Club and local television personality Norma Ashby organized the first C.M. Russell art auction. A portion of the proceeds from the auction of original 19th and 20th century Western art benefited the C.M. Russell Museum. Over time, this evolved into a week-long series of Western art auctions, gallery showings, public exhibitions, and more known as Western Art Week. Western Art Week is now the largest original Western art auction and exhibition in the United States. Between 1969 and 2003, the auction grossed $16 million and gave $3,771,088 to the museum. In 2009, the museum and the Art Club parted ways, with the museum organizing a new auction named The Russell, the sale to benefit the C.M. Russell Museum. The Ad Club continued the original C.M. Russell art auction in 2010, but shuttered the auction. The Russell held its first auction in 2010, and had net proceeds of $605,473. The second auction was held in March 2011. Governance and Star. The Trigg C.M. Russell Foundation, which owns and operates the museum, home, and log cabin studio, is governed by officers and a board of directors. Currently, the 5 officers are a chair, first vice chair, second vice chair, treasurer, and secretary. There are 43 members of the board of directors. This is an increase from the 27 directors and officers the organization had prior to a large expansion of the board in 2008. Board members are limited to 2 consecutive 3-year terms, but may be re-elected to the board after a year away from the board. The museum suffered a spate of staff turnover in the 1990s and early 2000s. In February 1999, the museum's executive director, Lorne Render, resigned to take a position at a museum in Kansas after 8 years on the job. Board member Dan Ewan resigned from the board and served as interim executive director from May to August 1999. But when Ewan returned to his private business, the museum hired Denver, Colorado-based art consultant Thomas Matham as interim executive director. Matham served from August to December 1999. Museum curator Elizabeth.The served as acting executive director from December 1999 to November 2000. A new executive director, Michael Warner, was appointed in 2000 and given a one-year contract. But Warner resigned in October 2001 after he and the board agreed that neither side was happy with the working relationship. Board member Barbara Moe agreed to serve as acting manager from November 2001 until a new executive director was hired. In April 2002, the board fired the museum's longtime curator, Elizabeth.The. The Great Falls Tribune, a local newspaper, reported that board members had interfered with her grant funding, her research, and her work. The and the museum settled out of court for undisclosed terms in June 2003. The museum hired Inez Woolens as its new executive director on June 10, 2002. During the next 2 years, nearly all the museum staff resigned. Woolens herself was fired in March 2004. Although the reasons for Woolens's dismissal were not made public, the local press had reported earlier that Woolens had been forced to resign from her previous position after officials at the Samuel P. Hahn Museum of Art discovered she did not have the doctorate degree which she claimed to have. 2 months later, the C.M.Russell Museum promoted curator of art Anne Moran to the position of executive director. Moran had been with the museum for only 4 months. Moran resigned and returned to her previous position in November 2008. Chief Financial Officer Susan Johnson was named interim director. After an 8-month search, the museum hired Darrell G. Beecham as its new executive director. Moran left in February 2010 to become curator of the National Cowboy and Amp Western Heritage Museum, and was replaced in December 2010 by Sarah L. Burt, formerly curator at the Joslyn Art Museum.